There is a piece of paper that exists in different versions in archives across the former Soviet Union. It is a demobilization form, and on thousands of these forms, filled out in the summer and autumn of 1945, there is a line where a clerk was supposed to write a woman's wartime occupation. Sniper, medic, loader in a tank crew, anti-aircraft gunner. On a great many of those forms, that line was left blank, or it was changed. Sniper became seamstress. Tank crew became worked in headquarters. Not because the women lied, because somebody else decided, after the war was won, what kind of war it was acceptable for them to have fought. I'm Arthur Finch, and I want to tell you about a number first, because numbers are where this story has to start. Roughly 800,000 women served in the Soviet armed forces in active combat or combat support roles during the Second World War. Not nurses kept safely behind the lines, though many were that too. Snipers, tank drivers, machine gunners, artillery spotters, combat medics who went over the top with the infantry because the wounded couldn't wait for the front to move. And within a few years of the war's end, the official record of what they had done began, quietly and deliberately, to shrink. I'll come back to that form and to exactly what happened to the women who filled them out. But first you need to understand how it was even possible for the Soviet Union to put that many women into combat roles in the first place, because no other major power in this war did anything close to it. Let's start with where we are, because the geography matters. This is the Soviet Union after June 1941, a country fighting for its survival in a war of a scale and brutality that is genuinely difficult to convey in numbers alone. By the end of 1941, German forces have advanced hundreds of miles into Soviet territory. Soviet losses, military and civilian combined, will eventually run into the tens of millions. This is not a war fought at arm's length. It reaches into nearly every household. And when a state is fighting for its existence on that scale, it reaches further into its population than it otherwise would. Women had already been part of the Soviet military apparatus before the war, in smaller numbers, in aviation clubs, in civil defense training, in the broader Soviet ideological commitment, at least on paper, to the equality of men and women in labor and in struggle. That commitment had mostly stayed theoretical. The war made it practical, and it made it practical with extraordinary speed. There's a particular point worth understanding here, because it sets the Soviet case apart from every other major combatant in this war. Britain and the United States put enormous numbers of women into uniform, in factories, in administration, in anti-aircraft spotting roles, in transport. Some came close to combat. Very few were issued a rifle and sent forward with the explicit purpose of killing the enemy at close range. The Soviet Union did this, deliberately, as policy, and did it at a scale no other power matched. That distinction is the whole reason this story is unusual enough to tell. By 1942, with manpower losses staggering and the need for trained personnel acute, the Soviet state began actively recruiting and conscripting women into roles that went well beyond nursing and clerical work. Komsomol, the communist youth organization, became one of the main channels. Young women, many still in their teens, volunteered in large numbers, and many who volunteered for one role were redirected by necessity into others. Sniper schools opened specifically to train women. The Central Women's School of Sniper Training, established in 1943, would go on to train over 1,000 women snipers who are credited collectively with many thousands of confirmed kills. I want to stop on that word, credited, because it matters for where this story is going. The credit existed. It was documented, verified by unit records, witnessed by commanding officers. The Soviet military, unlike most of its counterparts, did track and confirm female combat kills, did decorate women for valor, did promote them through the ranks. This is not a story about women being secretly smuggled into combat, against the wishes of a state that refused to acknowledge them. The state put them there. It trained them, equipped them, and for a period of years, it was proud of them. This is the part of the story people don't expect. The erasure didn't happen because the service was ever secret. It happened afterward, and you need to sit with that, because it changes what kind of story this actually is. This isn't a story about hidden women breaking into a closed world. It's a story about a door that was opened wide and then quietly closed again once it had served its purpose. Let me tell you about one woman, because numbers alone don't carry the weight of this. Her name was Rosa Shanina. She was 20 years old when she became a sniper on the 3rd Belarusian Front in 1944, after training at one of those women's sniper schools. She had grown up in a small village in the Russian north, one of several children, and had left home as a teenager to pursue an education the local school couldn't offer her. When the war reached her family directly, her older brother was killed at Leningrad. She requested combat training rather than the rear area assignment she had initially been given. She kept a diary, and this matters because it survives. And it's one of the relatively few first-hand accounts we have, in a woman's own words, from this specific role. Not reconstructed decades later by historians, but written in the moment, in pencil, in the field. In her diary, she wrote about the particular psychological weight of sniping, not the abstraction of the enemy, but watching a single, specific human being through crosshairs for minutes at a time before making the decision to kill him. She described the strange intimacy of it, the way a sniper comes to learn an opposing soldier's habits and routines across days of observation before that knowledge is used to end his life. She wrote about being afraid, about being exhausted, about wanting more than almost anything simply to be taken seriously by the men in her unit, rather than treated as a novelty or a mascot. About commanding officers who initially doubted her kill reports until they were independently confirmed by spotters. She was credited with at least 54 confirmed kills. Soviet and Western press at the time, yes, Western press, because for a brief period during the war, Soviet women snipers were genuinely a subject of Allied newspaper fascination, covered her unit and others like it as a notable feature of the Soviet war effort, with at least one American newspaper running a profile describing her as proof of how far the Soviet Union would go to resist the German invasion. She was killed in January 1945 in East Prussia, shielding a wounded artillery officer with her own body during an attack. She was 20 years old. That is not an obscure footnote. That was, briefly, public knowledge, documented in her own writing, in unit citations, in contemporary press coverage. I want you to hold on to how visible this all was while the war was happening. Hold on to it, because it's about to disappear. Snipers are the part of this story people have usually heard at least something about, if they've heard anything. The part almost nobody knows is what happened in the tanks. Soviet women served as tank crew members, drivers, loaders, occasionally commanders, in numbers that are still not fully reconstructed, partly because of exactly the kind of record-altering I mentioned at the start. This wasn't a token gesture or a handful of exceptional cases. Soviet armor production scaled up enormously through the middle years of the war, and the personnel needed to crew that armor scaled up alongside it. Drivers who had to understand a temperamental, often poorly maintained machine well enough to keep it running under combat stress. Loaders who had to move shells weighing tens of pounds in a cramped, deafening interior while the vehicle was under fire. Mechanics who had to diagnose and repair a damaged engine or track with enemy infantry potentially still in the air. One of the most documented cases is Maria Oktyabrskaya, who joined a tank crew in 1943 after her husband, an officer, was killed earlier in the war. She used her own savings to purchase a T-34 tank, which she named Fighting Girlfriend, and was accepted for training as its driver mechanic, a technically demanding role requiring real mechanical skill under combat conditions, not a ceremonial position. The Soviet military allowed and publicized this. A photograph of her standing beside the tank she had personally funded was circulated as a morale piece, proof to a wartime audience that the war effort reached into every level of society, including a widow with no military background who simply walked into a recruiting office with a bank draft and a request. She fought in multiple engagements, was wounded repeatedly, returned to her unit against medical advice, and was killed in early 1944 from wounds sustained while attempting to repair her tank's track under fire. climbing out of the vehicle in the middle of a battle, because the alternative was leaving her crew stranded. She was posthumously awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest decoration the state could give. Think about that for a moment. A woman who bought a tank, fought in it, died maintaining it under enemy fire, and was given her country's highest military honor for it. This is documented. This happened. It was publicized at the time, with photographs, with newspaper coverage, with an official citation that survives in the archive to this day. And within a generation, most Soviet citizens, let alone the rest of the world, had essentially no idea it had. I'll come back to why. But there's a third role I need you to understand first, because it's the largest in raw numbers, and it's the role that paid the highest collective price. The combat medics. Frontline medical personnel in the Red Army were disproportionately women, and their casualty rates were extraordinarily high, by some post-war Soviet estimates, comparable to infantry casualty rates. Because the job required moving into and across active fire to reach the wounded, rather than waiting for the line to stabilize. This wasn't triage in a tent behind the lines. It was crawling, often under direct fire, to drag a wounded soldier, sometimes a man twice your weight, back to any kind of cover. Soviet military doctrine credited frontline medical personnel with returning a substantial majority of wounded soldiers to active duty, specifically because care was administered so close to the point of injury, which meant putting medics, overwhelmingly young women, directly into the most dangerous ground on the battlefield, repeatedly, for years. Let me give this a face too, because it's easy for a casualty statistic to slide past you without landing. Her name was Valeria Nyarovskaya. She served as a medical orderly with a rifle division at Stalingrad, 18 years old, and the documented accounts of her service describe her repeatedly pulling wounded men from the battlefield under fire, sometimes more than 30 in a single engagement, dragging or carrying soldiers who outweighed her across open ground while under direct assault. In September 1943, near the Molochnaya River, her unit's position was overrun by German tanks. According to the citation later awarded to her, she ran toward an advancing tank carrying anti-tank grenades and destroyed it, at the cost of her own life, to keep it from reaching the wounded men she had spent the day pulling from the line. She was posthumously named a Hero of the Soviet Union. She was 19. I want to stop on the arithmetic of that story for a second, because it's worth sitting with rather than moving past. 30 wounded men carried to safety in a single day is not an abstraction. It's 30 individual decisions made under fire to go back out one more time. That was the job. Not occasionally, day after day, for as long as the body held out. These women were decorated. Their units cited their actions in official reports. Some of those reports survive in the archives to this day, in the original wartime language, naming names, listing specific acts of valor in specific battles on specific dates. So here is the part that matters. Here is what I told you I'd come back to. After 1945, the Soviet state did something it had never been forced to seriously confront before the war ended. It had to decide what post-war Soviet society was actually going to look like, and what role women who had fought, killed, been wounded, and commanded respect in combat roles were going to occupy in a peacetime narrative that was, almost immediately, reasserting much more conventional ideas about womanhood, motherhood, and rebuilding the population after staggering wartime losses. And the state's answer, not stated as official policy in a single decree, but enacted in practice across thousands of individual administrative decisions, was to walk much of it back. This is where that demobilization form comes back in. Beginning in 1945 and continuing through the demobilization process, many women veterans found their combat records altered, downgraded, or simply omitted on the paperwork that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Paperwork that determined pension eligibility, veteran status, social recognition, and access to benefits. A woman who had served as a sniper might find her occupation listed as something administrative. A former tank crew member might be recorded as having served in a support capacity. This wasn't universal, and it wasn't always malicious, in the sense of any individual clerk intending harm. Much of it reflected a broader, unspoken post-war discomfort with the idea of female combatants in a society that wanted urgently to return to pre-war gender norms after losing so many men that the demographic imbalance between men and women would shape Soviet society for decades. Listen to this, because it's the detail that tells you this wasn't simply forgetfulness. Soviet wartime propaganda had actively celebrated these women while the war was being fought. Posters, newsreels, press profiles, because their service was useful to morale and to the broader narrative of total national mobilization against an existential enemy. The same state apparatus that had publicized Rosa Shanina's kill count and decorated Maria Oktyabrskaya as a hero of the Soviet Union began, within years, constructing a post-war memorial culture around the war. Monuments, official histories, anniversary commemorations that centered overwhelmingly on male soldiers, male generals, and a narrative of heroic Soviet manhood defending the motherland. You'd assume that a state which had so visibly celebrated these women during the war would have wanted to keep celebrating them afterward, when the war became something to memorialize rather than something to win. You'd be wrong. The usefulness of the story changed, and so the story changed with it. During the war, a woman with a rifle was proof that the entire nation, every village, every family, stood against the invader. After the war, with the country needing to rebuild a population devastated by tens of millions of deaths, the priority shifted toward a more traditional vision of women as mothers and homemakers, rebuilding the next generation rather than embodying the last one's violence. The image of the woman sniper, however true, no longer served the story the state needed to tell. Women who had served were frequently met on return to civilian life, not with parades but with social suspicion, rumors and accusations, sometimes explicit and sometimes implied in how officials and neighbors treated them. That women who had lived among male soldiers for years must have been sexually available or morally compromised. Veteran women have described, in post-war interviews and memoirs collected decades later, being advised by other women, and sometimes by their own mothers, simply not to mention what they had done during the war when looking for husbands or work. The medals went into drawers. The stories went untold at the kitchen table, not because the women were ashamed of what they'd done, but because the society around them had decided, quickly and without much public debate, that what they'd done didn't fit the story it wanted to tell about itself. This is the part that's easy to misread, so I want to be precise about it. This was not a case of women's contributions being entirely hidden, the way certain other histories have involved active suppression of basic facts. The service records existed. Veterans organizations, when they catalogued service, generally did acknowledge that women had served. What was lost was something more specific, and in some ways more insidious: the texture of it. The combat specificity, the recognition in the dominant cultural memory that a woman could be a sniper and not just a nurse, a tank crew member and not just a clerk. The general fact survived in footnotes. The vivid individual, fully credited reality, the kind that would have made these women household names on the level of male war heroes, was allowed to fade. There was eventually a partial correction, and it's worth understanding why it happened, because it tells you something about how state memory works. Under Leonid Brezhnev in the 1960s, the Soviet state revived large-scale public commemoration of the war, building monuments, instituting Victory Day as a major annual holiday, and producing a wave of officially sanctioned war literature and film. Some women veterans were folded back into this commemorative wave. Maria Oktyabrskaya's story, for instance, was retold in Soviet media during this period, decades after her death. But this recognition tended to flow toward the same small handful of women who already held the highest decorations, the heroes of the Soviet Union. While the far larger population of women who had served with equal courage but without a posthumous medal to anchor a public story remained where they had been since 1945, acknowledged in principle, absent in practice. Stop for a second and consider what that meant for the women themselves. not as a historical abstraction, but as something they lived with for the rest of their lives. Imagine surviving 4 years of the war Rosa Shanina described in her diary. The fear, the exhaustion, the specific, deliberate act of taking a man's life through a rifle scope over and over, and then coming home to a society that would rather you said you'd been a typist. Not because anyone doubted you'd done it, because what you'd done no longer fit the story. It would take decades and largely the work of individual historians and a small number of determined journalists, rather than any state-led reckoning, to bring much of this back into focus. Soviet author Svetlana Alexievich spent years in the late 1970s and early 1980s interviewing hundreds of women veterans for what would become her book, The Unwomanly Face of War. And she has described, in interviews about that project, how many of these women, by then in their 50s and 60s, were telling her things they had never told their own families. Because for the first time in 30 years, someone in an official capacity was asking and treating the answer as something worth recording with the same seriousness as a man's war story would have been recorded. I'll say it again because it's the detail in this whole story that I keep returning to. 30 years. These weren't women who had forgotten what they'd done or who needed prompting to remember a buried trauma. They remembered everything. The cold, the names of the men in their units, the exact weight of a wounded soldier dragged across frozen ground. What they didn't have for 30 years was anyone in a position of authority who treated the memory as worth writing down. Alexievich's project wasn't an act of discovery in the way an archaeologist discovers a buried artifact. It was an act of permission. She gave them somewhere to put what had never stopped being true. Think about what that means. 30 years of silence, broken not by the state that had once decorated them, but by one writer with a tape recorder, decades later, willing to sit and listen. So let's go back to that demobilization form, because that's the image I want you to leave with. It is, on its face, a small bureaucratic document. A line, a job title, a clerk's handwriting. But on that line, in thousands of individual cases across the post-war Soviet Union, history made a choice about which version of a woman's war would be allowed to survive into the official record, and which version would have to wait for a writer, decades later, willing to ask different questions. Rosa Shanina's diary survived because she wrote it herself, in her own hand, and it was preserved independently of any official record that could later be altered. Maria Oktyabrskaya's story survived specifically because a hero of the Soviet Union citation is difficult to quietly erase once it's been publicly awarded. Valeria Gnarovskaya survived the same way, a medal, a citation, a name carved into the kind of record a clerk couldn't simply rewrite on a form. Most women didn't have a surviving diary, and most didn't receive the country's highest honor. Most had only that line on a form, filled out by someone else in the months after a war they had fought and survived. And for them, the record simply says what the state, at that particular moment, found convenient for it to say. There's something worth noticing in which stories survived and which didn't. It wasn't the most heroic acts that lasted in public memory. It was the ones that happened to leave behind a document too official to quietly rewrite. That should unsettle you a little, because it means the version of this history most people know is shaped less by what actually happened on those battlefields than by which paperwork proved durable afterward. The women who didn't get a hero of the Soviet Union citation were not less brave. They were simply less protected, on paper, from what came next. There's something I think about working through documents like these. The war they fought didn't change. The accuracy of what they did didn't change. What changed was simply who, afterward, had the power to decide what got written down and what got written over. It's a small thing, a line on a form, a clerk's handwriting. But multiplied across thousands of individual lives, it's how an entire dimension of a war can quietly disappear from the story a country tells about itself, even while the women who lived it are still in the room. I'm Arthur Finch. If you'd like to keep working through stories like this one with me, there's a link in the description to our community on Telegram, where I share more between videos. Thank you for spending this time with me.